Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute at 57 Post Street in San Francisco. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our second program of the Rising Writers Series. And tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Daniel Gumbiner for his new book, The Boatbuilder, which was nominated for the National Book Award. And Daniel will be in conversation with local writer Kevin Smokler. Before we begin, I'd like to find out how many of you are new to the Mechanics Institute. Who's never been here before? Wonderful, welcome. So I'd like to invite you to come back on a Wednesday at noon and take a free tour of our incredible library, which is on the second and third floors. Also, you'll see our International Chess Club, which is right down the hallway. And you'll also get an introduction to our programs and our history. Well, first of all, we were founded in 1854, so we have a long, long history here in San Francisco. Also, our programming includes author events such as these, a Friday night Cinema Lit film series. The library has ongoing writers groups and book clubs, prose group, technology classes, and the chess club has an ongoing tournament series and chess classes for all ages and levels. So it's all happening here 7 days a week, so we hope that you'll take the tour, become a member, and become part of our ever-growing cultural family here in downtown San Francisco. Also, I want to mention that at the end of our program, books will be on sale for both authors. We are also very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with McSweeney's of San Francisco, and we welcome those of you who are here through McSweeney's. And now I'd like to also introduce our co-curator, Ted Gioia. Ted is a critic who lives in San Francisco, and his work has appeared in The Believer, The American Scholar, Los Angeles Review of Books, It's Nice That, the Virginia Quarterly Review, and other publications. Currently, he is writing a book of essays about the evolution of California culture framed through food and the arts. Ted is also the former partnerships director of McSweeney's, and of course, as I mentioned, he's an ongoing co-curator for the Rising Writers Series here at the Mechanics Institute. He is also the founder of the site Fork Tongue, interviewing food critics on the future of food writing. So please welcome Ted Gioia.
Hello, and welcome to the second reading in the Rising Writers series. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. The seed for this series started when I first moved to San Francisco, and a friend told me that young writers just don't come to San Francisco anymore. And that seemed to be the popular wisdom. But so I came to Laura with the idea for the series because I was dissatisfied with this conventional wisdom, dissatisfied with the way, in fact, that many people talk about the Bay Area literary landscape today. So much talk is focused on the past. When people think of San Francisco fiction, they think of the 50s with the Beats, or the 2000s with Eggers, or New Yorkers vacationing to Noe Valley for a week to write a quick caricature of Silicon Valley. But nothing about what it actually means to be a young writer on the ground in the Bay Area today. Not 1955, not 2002, but right now in 2019. Because right now is an exhilarating literary moment with a boom of great first novels by diverse writers in our own backyard. But it's a moment that goes under-discussed. And we hope this series can be a forum to explore that sinuous question by offering a stage for emerging writers to have real talk about the issues, inspirations, and anxieties that matter to young writers in California today. And that's why we're so glad to partner with McSweeney's, a legendary independent publisher. We have Brian Dice, who is the president of McSweeney's, and Eric, who is also on the McSweeney staff. For those who don't know, McSweeney's, there's probably not been a better engine for emerging, exciting, fresh fiction in the Bay Area and beyond in the last 20 years than McSweeney's. They've championed writers from Michelle T. to Wells Towers to Hilton Als and many, many more than I could possibly name. And the latest in that line is tonight's reader, Daniel Gumbiner. Daniel was born and raised in Northern California. He graduated from UC Berkeley in 2011 and now lives in Las Vegas, where he works as the managing editor of The Believer. His first book, The Boatbuilder, was longlisted for the National Book Award and is a finalist for the California Book Awards. And I've read few books that capture that spiritual texture of Northern California, as well as Daniel's first novel. And he will be in conversation with another great cultural figure here, Kevin Smokler. Kevin is a writer, performer, and interdisciplinary maestro. He's the author of 3 books, most recently Brat Pack America, a love letter to 80s teen movies, out now. His essays in cultural criticism have appeared in Salon, BuzzFeed, the LA Times, and on NPR. On stage, he's interviewed actors, authors, and directors at libraries, universities, and festivals nationwide. And he is currently in the middle of directing a documentary on the contemporary comeback of vinyl records in America. So with that introduction, I am delighted to introduce Daniel and Kevin.
All right. I was told to give the people a little taste of what we're in for this evening.
Good.
So, what we are in for this evening. At 28 years old, Eli Berg Koenigsberg has never encountered a challenge he couldn't push through, until a concussion leaves him with lingering headaches and a weakness for opiates. Berg moves to a remote Northern California town to seek space and time to recover, but soon finds himself breaking into homes in search of pills. Addled by addiction and chronic pain, Berg meets Alejandro, a reclusive master boat builder, and begins to see a path forward. Alejandro offers Berg honest labor, but more importantly, a new approach to his suffering, a template for survival amid immense pain. Nurtured by his friendship with Alejandro and aided by the comradeship of many of Tolina's colorful residents, Berg begins to return to himself. Written in gleaming prose, this is a story about resilience, community, and what it takes to win back your soul. I agree. I had a great time reading it, absolutely.
Thank you.
So we are catching you at kind of the tail end of your tour here. Tell us how it's been so far.
Yeah, it's been good. Well, I mean, thank you to everyone for coming out here and to the Mechanics Institute for having me. It's really an honor to be here. You guys are either, I can't tell if you guys aren't Warriors fans or you just really love literature, but I'm glad you're here.
Could be both.
Could be both. Tour, there were sort of 2 phases to it. The first phase was more when the book first came out, and no one had read it because it had just come out. So it was kind of the work of the event was explaining it to someone who had no concept of it. And then the second phase of it, more people had read it, so it was interesting to kind of hear from people and interact with people who sort of knew what the book was about and had some framework of it. But yeah, it's kind of winding down now. This is one of the, I think will be one of the last events I do for it.
Do you think you will miss this kind of thing, or is it like, thank God it's winding down?
I think I feel ready to move forward. It's a funny thing about book publishing, which is just that moves at a glacial speed. So by the time this book is coming out, I had already been thinking about other projects and working on other projects, and so to return to it was an interesting experience too, to kind of come back and reacquaint myself with the work after not really being in the midst of it. We were talking about this earlier, but it's kind of, it feels you process it in different ways after you've finished it than when you're going through it. And there are sort of, like any experience, we were talking about sort of the analogy of college. When you come out of college, it's sort of like, there are people ask you how your experience was, and you tell stories about it, and maybe there are some threads that you carry through and or anecdotes that you tell often, but it's not, obviously you're not conveying the whole experience of the thing. So I think it's a little bit similar.
I'm assuming you kept your day job while you were doing all this stuff, while you were touring. So tell me about, to put it sloppily, tell me about this sort of view from the other side of the desk, or I guess I would ask it, who are you when you're editing a magazine versus writing a novel? Yeah.
So I work as the managing editor of The Believer, which used to be published by McSweeney's and is now published out of UNLV in Las Vegas. I think they're they're different mindsets, but they're related. I think the sort of mind space I'm in when I'm working on something or when I'm writing is much more open and accepting and looking to kind of just move wherever the story takes me, and to not be super critical of what I'm doing and really and thinking too closely about whether or not something's working in a given moment, and just kind of trying to pay attention to the flow of my thinking. Whereas with editing, you're much more critical. You're looking to notice sort of discrepancies in the work or problems. You're fault finding, and if you fault find too much, I think when you're working on something creative, you can trip yourself up. And so there's a bit of, but at the same time, you need that faculty too to revise your work, and to, at some point you need to step back and look at it with that mindset too. So I think it is helpful to practice that, or it's helpful to me to practice that as an editor too, and to have that skill and sort of be flexing that muscle in my regular job.
The mistakes that first-time novelists make are not hard to find. They are.
In the book, you mean?
No. I'm talking culturally
Yeah,
speaking
yeah,
and
yeah.
historically speaking. Like a rogues gallery of mistakes, first-time novelist mistakes are legendary and well-known and oft-quoted. I'm assuming that you are aware of many of these, and so I'm curious which ones you had in mind while you were writing, if nothing else than to steer clear of them.
Yeah, I think that was always, mostly I tried to not worry about that too much for fear of what I was mentioning before, of just kind of like stifling my own experience. And there definitely were times when I was writing where I worried about that kind of thing, and I worried about the coherence of the work, and the sort of solution I came to for that kind of fear was to just try and focus on what was interesting to me in any given moment, even if it didn't feel like it was going to solve my problem. So, for example, if I encountered something like that, like, oh, it seems like it's veering in this direction, like melodramatic or something like that, I would just try and bring myself back to what I actually cared about in the work. And in doing so, at times that made it feel as though I was putting together a bunch of disparate pieces, because the thing I was interested in a given moment didn't necessarily feel like it cohered with the other things I had been interested in at different points in the writing process. But I think over time, there's this slow process of accretion where you sort of the way you see the world begins to materialize by virtue of just sticking to that course. Because your interests do amount to something when they're sort of aggregated.
Absolutely. I think the Boatbuilder is about a number of things, which I think is one of my favorite things about it. It is definitely an addiction novel, but it isn't like the 47th addiction novel you've read, because addiction is another topic that is well-trod ground in fiction. So, and I find it particularly, I've never attempted to write fiction, but I think as a reader, I find it particularly hard to bring new light to the experience of addiction in literature. And I feel for novelists who try. So I'm curious what research and other novels informed you in writing a book about it, and writing a novel about addiction, and what pitfalls did you try and avoid?
Yeah. So addiction, it is a big part of the book, but I think what I was more interested in the story was the experience of pain that precipitated the addiction, and sort of the different methods of like what one does when one encounters chronic pain. And that's sort of the main character in the book, Berg, has suffered this head injury, and as a result of this head injury, he has chronic headaches. And he's prescribed pills for the headaches, and that's ultimately what leads him to the addiction. But the sort of, what I see as one of the central questions of the book is kind of just like, what do you do when things sort of aren't getting better for you? And he tries a lot of stuff to deal with these headaches, and they're just a constant part of his life. And so part of what he's trying to figure out is how to often we're told that story of healing in which pain is eliminated from the equation. It's like something is going wrong and then it's fixed. And in this story, it's more like something is going wrong and it continues to go wrong. And so what do you do how do you live a meaningful life when that is a constant? And so his experience with boat building is part of what teaches him to move forward in a way, because I don't know how many of you have experience with craft, but part of what Berg is trying to do, and part of the reason he becomes addicted, is because he's trying to escape what's happening to him, as opposed to just sort of accepting that it's the reality of what's transpiring. And the working through boat building kind of allows him to bring his attention to the reality of things as they are. When you're working in boat building, if you have, say you're working on like a joint, like the pieces of wood either fit together or they don't, right? You can't kid yourself about what the state of things are. Whereas in your mind, if you're thinking about, like whether or not you're doing okay, or like psychologically, you can kind of twist things and kid yourself. But what boat building does for him is it kind of brings him into the present moment and forces him to acknowledge things as they are, and sort of like trains that faculty of mind. And I sort of strayed off your question, but that's addiction. I think the thing that was interesting to me, or about Berg's character, or the thing that I wanted to explore, was that sort of central question of how one approaches something that doesn't improve.
Straying is where the interesting things happen.
Yeah.
So, I think it's really interesting that for a novel that is so much about physical things, things, objects, physical labor, working with one's hands, you would think that choice, as a reader, I would think that choice would kind of burrow its way into the skin of the novel, and it would be a novel that would be very plot-heavy at the same time, where the act of being about objects would reflect itself in a novel that would be very concrete and specific with event as well. And yet, this is not a novel where a lot of big things happen.
Yeah.
This is a novel where things kind of exist between life's bigger moments.
Yeah.
Tell us about that choice, what our Yiddish brethren would refer to as schmaying,
Yeah.
i.e. hanging around.
Yeah, there is a lot of hanging out. I think that sort of goes back to what I was saying before about just sort of my focusing on what was interesting to me, or what I sort of found myself naturally attracted to. And I don't know if I thought about it very sort of rationally as a choice as I was writing the book. I think, and it's interesting stepping back from it now and seeing that it was a choice that I was making along the way, but I don't know if I was necessarily thinking like, oh, okay, I didn't set out to write a book that like didn't have that much plot. It was sort of just like the things I was interested in happened to not be plot. And it's interesting because the new novel that I just finished a draft of, I think is actually pretty plot heavy. And it just so happened that that was where that story took me. But yeah, I don't know if it was a super conscious choice.
Laura or Pam, could I get a glass of water? I'm going to start sounding like George Burns in a minute. I love how much of the Boatbuilder is about place, a specific place. I'm the kind of reader who gets a real flea in my ear about those kind of things. If I read a novel that takes place in Indianapolis, I start saying, well, why Indianapolis? Why not Terre Haute? It's the kind of thing I do. So thank you. And as such, I think that's a really interesting pairing with how much of, we sort of, as the readers, we kind of enter this book about 30% of the way through, maybe
Yeah.
maybe even more than that, meaning a lot of stuff has happened before page 1.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of that kind of storytelling technique. There was a video game from 1,000 years ago called Myst, where I
played it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You start the game and it's like the
Yeah.
whole game has happened before
Yeah.
like you, the protagonist, ever show up.
Yeah, I was really just trying to write Myst. That was
Yeah,
what I was-
exactly,
yeah.
exactly, except on a boat.
Yeah.
But it puts the protagonist in a really interesting position then,
Uh-huh.
because so much of the story has happened already, and you're sort of being guided through it by the protagonist, and you almost want to say, well, can I rewind? Can I go to before page 1 and find out what happened back there? So how do you conceive of the job of the protagonist then? Because so much of the story is happening around him and happened before we got there. So we don't have access to that through him.
Yeah, there was a lot more in the first draft that was then cut out. And so there was the original draft was actually told from 2 perspectives. So that's one thing that's really different. It would toggle between the Alejandro's perspective and Berg's perspective, and the finished book is just Berg's perspective. And it also had a lot more flashbacks and a lot more backstory that sort of like filled in some of those things maybe in a more detailed manner. But when I was going through the editing process, one of the early readers said to me that he felt that I was obscuring the elements of the forward-moving plot with the flashbacks, that I didn't truly understand what was happening in the forward-moving plot, and that I was flashing back to kind of just like get out of it, essentially. And he advised me to cut all of the flashbacks and just see, or cut most of the flashbacks and just see what I had there in the forward-moving story. And the other thing he said to me was, he was like, no one ever finished a book and was like, man, I really love that book, but I wish there were more flashbacks.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
So I did that, and he was right. There were certain aspects of the story. What I realized was that essentially I was mostly telling Berg's story, and that the story was meant to be told from his perspective and his perspective only. And so I changed that, and then I also kind of eliminated many of these flashbacks, and so that's how it ended up in its current form. And so there was sort of like one big first draft and one big second draft, and those were like the kind of like seismic moments, but that's how it ended up starting in that way.
I love your choice that the ending is not only open-ended but sparse in terms of words on the page and the voice of the author at the ending. In my experience, a lot of fiction endings are particularly verbose because and I'm guilty of this too. The author realizes they're running out of time, or they've come to the ending, and there's a whole lot of things they want to say.
Yeah.
It almost feels like a trait borrowed from musical theater, where you realize you're at the finale and you have to sing really loudly and hold the note at the very end. So I'm interested in that choice of yours. Tell me about the ending and why there's so little said.
Yeah, the ending, that is, I think, always the hardest thing to write, and to know where to end something. I think with this story, I didn't want, one thing that I very much didn't want to do was I didn't want to make it seem as though, without giving too much away, I didn't want to make it seem as though like everything was solved, because again, as I sort of mentioned earlier, the story is in large part about the experience of like not having things solved for you. And so I think that is maybe part of what gives it an open-ended feeling, is you're like, what happens to Berg, I think he has certainly changed as a person, but I don't know if it's necessarily clear what will happen to him.
It's open-ended right down to the title, because we don't know who the title refers to, do we?
Yeah. That is, that's sort of like built into the title a little bit of like who is the boat builder? Is it Berg, or is it Alejandro? But I liked the title because I felt like it drew attention to sort of like the central focus of the book and the main work of the book.
You done any boat building?
I have, yeah. So I actually, when I started writing this book, I was taking a class with a man named Bob Dar, who teaches boat building in Sausalito. And he has a Saturday class that he no longer teaches anymore. He's retired, but it's now taught by his two of his former students. It's an hour-long class, or sorry, it's an 8-hour class, but it's 1 day a week on Sundays. And for the first part of it, Bob teaches the whole class like a sort of general lesson. You're basically working on one of the boats that he's building at any given time together. And then for the second part of the class, you work on your own skills, and it's very kind of like programmatic. Like you can't advance to the next skill until you've learned how to do the first one sufficiently. And that was sort of where I first started thinking about the book. I didn't go into the class not thinking I want to write a book about boat building, but I was interested in boats. I thought wooden boats I was interested in them as aesthetic objects, and I found them very beautiful, and I wanted to learn more about their construction. And I took the class, and in the middle of the class, between those two periods, basically everyone sits around at this circular table in the middle of the workshop and kind of just hangs out and talks. And Bob would tell stories about living on Tomales Bay, and he used to have a boat shop on Tomales Bay. And I mean, part of it was that Bob was just a really incredible storyteller and was very compelling to listen to, but it was also that he was telling stories about sort of like the landscape and the place and the county that I was from in a way that felt very resonant and that I hadn't heard someone tap into, just in terms of like the strangeness of this rural place meeting that is also at like close to an urban center and is infused with this kind of like Old West and hippie influence and the sort of strange mix that creates, an environment that creates. And I thought, I've never actually heard of a book that was set in that particular place. And that's kind of how I really first started thinking about the book through Bob's stories and thinking about that as a setting before I really had any of the characters or any of the other components of the book conceived of.
I did this sort of thing one time with a puppeteer who talked about how his left shoulder was about like 20% larger than his right shoulder, because he had to spend all of his time like this with his hand controlling a puppet.
That can't be good for you.
No, he had to like specially design shirts and suit coats to have a bigger left shoulder.
Or he would just go home and lift his other arm for like the whole day to even it out.
It was insensitive of me to not ask how he solved this problem, but what are the equivalent deformed left shoulders of boat building? What are the occupational and physical hazards of this hobby?
Well, there's a lot of ways you can get hurt. You mean like physical?
Yeah. How does it leave its marks on one's body if you do this thing avidly?
I think in many ways it's actually pretty good for you because it is sort of like you are, when you're working on a boat, you're casually physical throughout the day. You're outside. That being said, there are definitely things that can go wrong. There are chemicals involved on occasion. There are obviously very sharp tools that you can hurt yourself with if you're not careful. And that is also another thing that kind of like breeds focus is, you're like, this thing is really sharp. I should look at what I'm doing with it. I think in many ways it can be a very healthy profession for you because it is, physical but not excessively so. And I think it's also, it's just a very pleasant occupation. Like everything smells nice, like the wood smells nice. The place that you're working is usually physically attractive and pleasant, and often by the water. So there's a lot about it that's really nice. But yeah, you can hurt yourself for sure.
You have any boat building injuries that?
Nothing serious. No, I nicked myself here and there, but yeah.
If you and Berg ran into each other at an event here at the Mechanics, would you recognize one another?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I would recognize all of the characters in the book in a way because I think part of myself is in all of them in some inflected form. None of them are like one-to-ones of any person in my life or myself, but I think they're all, to a certain extent, voices and the experiences of my life definitely infuse, the experiences that they have in the book too.
There's definitely a bit of a Steinbeck quality to it, that you're kind of, in a neighborhood and people drift in and out, and you can run into someone, coming this way, or that you may not see for another 90 pages. Or
yeah, he was a big influence. In fact, I had read several of his books, but I had never read Cannery Row, and one of the early readers of the book, after they read it, was like, you need to read Cannery Row, because this book is really similar to Cannery Row.
Point Reyes Row or something.
Yeah, which was, then after I read it, I was like, wow, that's a very nice thing of that person to say. I don't know if it's totally true, but I do admire his work a lot, yeah.
Tell me what other writers you walk in the footsteps of.
Yeah, I mean, Steinbeck, I think, is someone who was definitely influential for me. Wallace Stegner, I think, is another person who was really important to me, particularly when I was younger, when I was in college. I think he was the first person who I read, who I felt like captured something of what it felt like to grow up in the West, and to sort of feel a little bit like you are outside of the main thrust of the culture, and to describe the sort of chaotic experience of culture in the West too, the kind of like hodgepodge nature of it, but also the beauty and the grandeur. And so he was really important. I felt really connected to him in college. So, and another Western writer who's important to me, Mary Austin, who's the naturalist who wrote beautifully about the Mojave Desert, I think. She's someone who I've engaged with closely more recently because I now live in Las Vegas. So that's someone who I think about a lot down there. More contemporary writers, Alejandro Zambra is someone who was really important to me in terms of just the sort of the quiet strength of his work. He's very tender, but he's also strong, and I find that really admirable, and I enjoy being in his brain. Bay Watkins is another person who I really admire her ambition and her sort of sense of inventiveness at the level of the line, but also in sort of the broader picture of her books, and just kind of like the heart of her books are really wonderful. So those are a few. Yeah.
You want to tell us about this new novel you just turned in a draft of?
Yeah. So it's called Paradise. It's set in Nevada, and it's sort of it's a story of there are 4 main characters, and they're kind of like all orbiting around this corruption scandal that's happening involving a police department. And one of them is an MMA fighter, and it's him and his trainer, and then the other 2 are journalists. And so the story kind of moves between the city and the sort of countryside of Nevada, and it's kind of I think it's my hope is that it reads like it explores some of what is really beautiful about that place, which is where I live now, in terms of its just kind of vast openness. It's both in its cities and in the country. It's a place that is very accepting, has very few rules, and there's a lot that is really beautiful about that, and there's a lot that is problematic too. And so that's kind of a lot part of what this book is exploring.
I'm going to ask one more thing, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Good. I'd like you to tell us about the last great book you read that was absolutely nothing like The Boatbuilder.
Yes. I think it would have to be Megan O'Gieblin's Interior States. I don't know if anyone's read that. It came out this year, but it's a series of essays, and I really think it's like not an exaggeration to say she's like the Joan Didion of the Midwest. Like she writes these essays about the Midwest that are so both full of love, but also highly critical and sensitive to the nuances of the place. And it's interesting too because she is one of the things, there's a lot of stuff that's really great about the book, but one of the things that's really special about it is she's very interested in trying to understand people who have radically different beliefs than her, which in this particular political moment is incredibly refreshing, I think. And that's in part because her own biography is one of kind of crossing the pale of belief. She was raised as an incredibly fundamentalist Christian, and then fell out of, and went to like one of the major Christian colleges, but then fell out of the church when she was in college and ended up becoming a writer. And so the book kind of intersperses her own story and her own life in terms of living in the Midwest throughout that period with these sort of more regional observations. And so I think it's a special book, and I think she has a gift in that sense of being able to pay attention to people and listen to people with whom she has very foundational disagreements.
Can you repeat her name?
Megan O'Gieblin.
O'Gieblin?
Yeah. It's spelled kind of strangely, but I can write it down for you later.
Something States, what's the?
Interior States.
Interior States.
Yeah, it's her first book.
Because the world is actually the size of this table right here, her agent is a high school classmate of mine.
Oh, wow.
And he sent me a note recently saying, hey, I got this book coming out, and I don't know if you're going to like it, but the author went to Michigan, and that's where we're from, and it's a female essayist, and she writes about like what you just described, and it's a little Maggie Nelson, and it's a little Leslie Jameson. I'm like, just stop talking, just send it to me, like now, just or tell me where I can get it. Like he knows me, that was all he had to say, and I was already in, and now based on what you've said, I think I don't know why I'm sitting here and not reading it. But
She's a talent.
Yeah. Daniel, thank you. This was
Thank
really
you.
great.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We have some time for some questions. Who out there has one? Oh, do we have to wait for the microphone to get over here?
Coming your way. Testing 1, 2.
Hi. I actually have, I guess one is more of a comment and one is more of a question. So I'll start with the comment. I thought what you said about backstory was really fascinating, because I think that is one of the faux pas of the first novel. And I think when we write first novels, there's this, we're explaining to ourselves how this person got to where he or she is. So we have to write all this backstory, and then we think we need it. But, and maybe sometimes we do, maybe whatever. But the idea of paring that all away and just looking at what the forward moving story is a really interesting. I'm going to borrow that and talk to my students about that, because I think that's really interesting.
Making things happen in here, that's awesome.
Huh?
I said we're making things happen in here, that's awesome.
And then my question is, can you talk, I'm very curious to hear about your decision to fictionalize the name of the town. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, I have thoughts on why you may have done that, but I'm more interested in hearing you talk about why you did that than projecting onto you. So.
Yeah, I think fictionalizing the town allowed me to sort of let the town shapeshift in a way that was natural to the actual story and kind of like the emotional truth of the story, the emotional heart of it. And so I think I didn't want to get caught up in kind of like trying to nail down the exact reality of a thing so much as I wanted to capture the feeling of it. And so that allowed me to do that. It allowed me to pick the things from that region and that place that felt emblematic or that felt important to be in there without having to be concerned of whether or not it was an exact reproduction of the thing. Yeah.
I haven't read the book, so I don't know if there's an obvious answer to this, but you talked about trying to have a strong sense of place and the feeling of the landscape and the city and the towns nearby. What about time? Did you try to write to today or to some contemporary sense of where we are? I mean, what did you think about that? Like you thought about
like time moving. What about time as moving through the book, or what about just like in
this moment in time,
in,
2018,
like,
19?
Yeah. I think I did want it to be in the contemporary moment, and so I was, that was something that was on my mind in terms of, in little nuances of crafting the story.
How do you do that when you write fiction? How do you do that without being too obvious, without throwing in, like the president's name or something? I don't know. I don't write fiction.
Yeah, no, I know, because it can feel like, oh, here's this marker for, and then he took out his iPhone. Yeah. I think it's a feel thing. It's like as with so much of writing, it's a trial and error process where you are kind of like testing a thing, and then you look at it and does it feel right? And if it doesn't, then you have to cut it. And that's sort of the thing. That's one of the things that I learned to be better at over the process of writing this book, was just trusting myself that there was a better thing waiting for me, and that I didn't have to just go with the thing that I had written because I wanted to be done. So often we get impatient because for whatever reason, we want to be done, or it's frustrating and we don't like that we don't have an answer, and so we settle for something that we know doesn't work. And so part of what I was learning to do throughout the process was to just pay attention to when I knew it didn't work, and really listen to that, because it's so easy to gloss over that and be like, well, I'm just going to keep going. And sometimes you do need to keep going, right? If you get caught up on one detail for too long. But the better thing to do, I think, is just mark it down and be like, that doesn't work, and put like a symbol in there, TK, whatever you use, and just be like, that I didn't figure that out yet, and keep moving that way, as opposed to trying to decide that it was finished. And so I think I sort of apply that kind of thinking to details of that nature.
You mentioned that you took the substantial suggestions of some early readers, and I was wondering who are those readers, and how do you know that they're the right ones?
Yeah, well, those suggestions were from someone who had mentored me in different ways, who I trusted a lot. So I think that was part of what made me available to the suggestions. But yeah, it is really hard to know who to trust with your work. I mean, I had that experience with this new novel too that I'm just finishing up, of just, when you give someone a work of art, they're gonna have a really different reaction. Everyone has a really different reaction to it. There's a reason Goodreads is so crazy, and everyone has so many different opinions on. It's the same thing when you hand a manuscript to someone, and so you have to, you have to figure out what to listen to and what resonates with you, and what to discard and what doesn't feel useful. My friend Caitlin, who is a poet in Vegas, she's funny. She has this policy where she says, "Trust no one." But and you do need to trust someone, right? So yeah, it's just again, it's kind of like a feel thing, being like, does this seem right to me? Does this criticism feel reasonable and like it would help? And if not, discard it.
There's also the weight of what you're asking too. Like asking someone to read a poem is different than asking someone to read a novel.
Yeah.
A novel is
It's a big task.
is a substantial investment of time, and and unless you're kind of dead inside, an investment of emotional energy too.
Yeah, and I think the first novel, people were eager to read it because they were like, oh, it's like Daniel's first novel. But now with the second book, everyone's like, okay, another one. Like, gotta read
You have
this
to
again.
pretend you don't know those people and find a whole new set too.
Yeah.
I'm really impressed just by the number of characters that you talk about, because you're describing this whole town. And I'm just wondering about how you just managed all the people and how you knew when is too much to describe about a person and when is, how you can,
Yeah, that was one of the most enjoyable parts of writing the book to me, I think, was getting to, I really enjoy working with those secondary characters. And many of them actually, like I mentioned before, there was an earlier draft that had a much more, that was much longer. And a lot of those people had a more prominent role in that draft, and then they were paired away. And in some ways, I think, I miss them having a bigger them being more central in the book, but I also thought it gave the book a feeling of fullness to have them in there and to sort of like know what they were about, and kind of like you were mentioning of like, it ends up being, when you cut away all of that backstory, it's still there. Like you still know what it is, and so in some ways it functions as like an outline. And those characters feel like lived and real, even if you don't get you don't get the whole vision of them. But it's, for you as a writer, it's helpful because you've had to sketch out their whole reality. And so I think I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but yeah.
It's very much like what actors do with the backstory of their character. When they present on stage, you're not getting the whole backstory, but you're seeing in the present. It's very, very similar.
Yeah.
Question back here.
Hey, Daniel. I'm intrigued and curious about your new novel, Paradise, and the characters that you described as well as the setting. If you could talk a little bit about what was the inspiration and the research behind the MMA fighter, the trainer, and the police department, because I assume that that's not part of your upbringing or your natural environment.
Maybe it is.
Yeah, it was just sort of, it was drawn from experiences I had living in Nevada. And so just kind of like taking in different elements of that universe, and like I had mentioned to Kevin earlier, just seeing like, oh, that's kind of, the MMA stuff was in part interesting to me because I really didn't understand it. And it's mixed martial arts fighting. It's like the very intense, sort of like boxing, but you can do other stuff.
If pro wrestling was real, it
yeah.
would be MMA fight.
So
Yeah.
as part of the research, are you training them?
Was I training?
Part of the research, are you training them?
No. Yeah, no, I did, although I did go to an amateur fight that actually was one of my friend's roommates he is an interior designer, and he is also an amateur MMA fighter. And
Interesting.
yeah, he's like this little guy, like absolutely ripped. And so we went to go see him fight. And it was in this one of the sort of like off-strip casinos that are for locals, and it's really intense because it's super long. You go for like the amateur fights. I don't know if you've been to one, but yeah, they're like 4 hours, and you see like 15 different fights or whatever. So we went to go see it. So I did some stuff like that kind of research. But yeah, it was just sort of one of those things. I mean, with that, I think I just didn't, when I got to Las Vegas, I realized it was a really big part of the culture, and that it was important for some reason, and also seemed kind of like particular to the place. It didn't seem quite as important in other cities, and so I thought that was interesting. and I wanted to understand it more. And that's how I started to look into that.
Any other questions? Okay, right here.
Hi, I have a question about structure. I'm really curious about the idea of structure as a container for your intuition. And you had talked in the very beginning of the talk about like kind of sniffing out your interest and knowing when you're on it and when you're not. And I'm wondering if structure plays a part in that for you at all?
Yeah, I think structure feels like a component of that to me. Like it feels like something that you need to pay attention to whether or not it's working. I'm not someone who really like plans very much, in part because I think what I enjoy about writing is kind of finding something unexpected. And I think if I were to plan out the structure of my novel and know kind of what was going to happen, I would get bored. Part of what's interesting to me is moving through something and finding out where it's going to go. So I don't think about structure too much over the course of like the writing the work, but I think retrospectively it is important to look at and I think kind of like apply that same type of mindset of just thinking like, does this feel like is it structured as it should be, or would it work smoother now that I'm outside of it and I can look down on it from sort of a more panoramic view?
Well, I guess my question's a little bit related. You had talked a lot about, or a little bit about moving, concentrating on the moving forward in the novel as a way to keep yourself working and also to keep the plot moving. When you did encounter, if you did encounter major creative roadblocks where you found yourself absolutely psychologically stuck, you didn't know where you were going to go next, how did you overcome that? And did those things tend to be more of a crisis of confidence that you weren't sure that you could find your way out of the mess, or was it more, the story is not leading me anywhere that will make sense or that will make this work?
Yeah, usually I would like go outside for a run or something,
Okay.
or like do something different or work on a different part of the book maybe. But I think you do so much of the creative process is just like finding your way and knowing when you're up against something that isn't working, and instead of just trying to like yank it so that it works, just like paying attention to the resistance and being like, oh, there's resistance here. That's interesting. I wonder why that is the case, and sort of registering that. And usually once you get to that point of registering it, you've figured out that you're able to see what's wrong. So much of the time you can't see what's wrong because you're trying to make something different. And that trying blinds us to actually looking at the thing itself.
So rather than forcing it, it was more recognizing that the path was there. It was a matter of trying to get it revealed.
Yeah, recognizing the resistance. And then usually once I was able to recognize that, I was able to see what about it was upsetting to me or didn't work. Then you have to go fix it.
The hard part.
Yeah.
What did Alejandro say? Like, don't race through the task too quickly. Just be in the task.
Yeah. Some of that is in the book.
Yeah.
Like some of that is
like
sort
the
of
metaphor of boat building for writing, or vice versa.
right. Yeah. So that is. I think there's definitely a correlation between some of those things.
We didn't just graft it on your novel
No,
without your
no.
consent. Like,
Yeah.
Any other questions? Comments? Inquiries? Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank Daniel Gumbiner and Kevin Smokler for a wonderful conversation. And also, special thanks to Ted Gioia. And also, I just want to remind you that our next program is on May 1st, Wednesday at 6:30, with Namwali Sirpal and Lydia Keisling. So please join us for our next Rising Writers. Thank you for coming.
don't forget to mention the book sales.
Oh, and books for sale.
So the man can sell some books here.